The rain in the city didn't just fall, it interrogated the pavement. It was 2:32 a.m., the hour of the lost and the insomniac. Arthur Pendelton sat in a corner booth of the Starlight Diner, a place where the grease on the walls was older than his inheritance. He looked entirely out of place in his tailored charcoal overcoat, his silver cufflinks catching the flickering buzz of a dying neon sign outside. To anyone else, the diner was a last resort. To Arthur, it was a sanctuary from the suffocating silence of his own success. At 42, Arthur had reached the pinnacle of what society called winning. He was the CEO of Pendelton Holdings, a man whose signature could move markets and whose absence could tank stocks. But tonight, he didn't feel like a titan. He felt like a ghost. He watched the steam rise from a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt beans and regret, wondering when the world had become so monochromatic. That was when he really noticed Clara. She wasn't a manic pixie dream girl or a cinematic beauty in distress. She was simply exhausted. She moved with a mechanical precision that only comes from years of surviving on tips and adrenaline. Her uniform, a faded blue polyester dress that had seen better decades, was crisp but thinning at the elbows. Her name tag was pinned slightly crooked. Arthur watched her handle a belligerent drunk at the counter with a weary grace. She didn't argue, she didn't raise her voice. She just refilled his mug with a steady hand, her eyes fixed on some 0.3 inches behind his head. It was the look of someone who had stopped dreaming because dreams required energy she didn't have to spare. "Another one?" she asked, appearing at Arthur's booth. Her voice was raspy, like crushed velvet. Arthur looked up. Up close, her eyes were the color of oversteeped tea. There were faint shadows beneath them, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. "Please," Arthur said. "And maybe a slice of whatever pie is least likely to give me food poisoning." Clara gave a microscopic ghost of a smile. "The apple is fresh. The cherry is a commitment. I'd go with the apple." "Apple it is, Clara," he said, reading her tag. As she walked away, Arthur felt a strange, sharp pang in his chest. It wasn't pity, he hated pity. It was a recognition of a different kind of prison. He was trapped in a gilded cage of expectations and quarterly reports, she was trapped in a cycle of survival. The difference was that his cage had a view. When she returned with the pie, the diner had emptied out. The rain was drumming harder now, a rhythmic percussion against the glass. Arthur poked at the crust, but his mind was elsewhere. He pulled his leather wallet from his coat. In it sat a checkbook and a stack of bills that could pay for this diner 10 times over. He thought about his weekend. He was supposed to fly to Zurich for a board meeting. He was supposed to buy another vintage Porsche he didn't need. He was supposed to be Arthur Pendelton, the unflappable. What if I just broke the system? He thought. He looked at the bill Clara had left on the table. Total, $12.45. He took out his fountain pen, a heavy, gold-nibbed instrument that felt like a weapon in his hand. He looked at the tip line. Normally, he was a standard 25% man. Precise. Predictable. But the stillness of the night and the sheer weight of his own boredom pushed him toward the edge of an impulse. He wrote a 5. Then a 0. Then a comma. He felt a rush of dopamine, a genuine spark of electricity he hadn't felt in years. He added 3 more zeros. $50. It was an absurd amount. It was the price of a mid-sized sedan. It was 2 years of a college education. It was, for someone like Clara, probably the difference between drowning and breathing. To Arthur, it was the cost of a mediocre wine tasting in Napa. The disparity of it made him feel sick and powerful all at once. He signed his name with a flourish, the same signature that authorized billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions, and tucked the receipt under the heavy glass sugar shaker. Arthur didn't wait for her to find it. He didn't want the awkwardness of the thank you, or the inevitable tears, or the "are you sure?" that would follow. He wanted the act to remain a pure, chaotic injection of luck into the universe. He stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the door. The bell chimed a lonely, thin sound. "Have a good night, sir," Clara called out from behind the counter, her back to him as she scrubbed a stubborn stain on the prep table. "Good luck, Clara," Arthur replied, his voice barely a whisper. He stepped out into the rain. His driver, a stoic man named Miller, opened the door of the black Maybach idling at the curb. The interior smelled of expensive leather and ozone. As the car pulled away, Arthur looked back at the diner. It looked like a tiny, glowing island in a sea of dark asphalt. He felt a fleeting sense of warmth, a self-congratulatory glow that whispered, "You did something good today." The drive back to Pendelton Manor took 20 minutes. The estate sat on a hill overlooking the Sound, guarded by wrought iron gates and a security system that cost more than a small country's defense budget. Arthur walked through the foyer. His footsteps echoed on the white Carrara marble. The house was perfect. Every painting was curated, every vase was positioned to the millimeter. It was also dead. There was no sound of laughter, no smell of cooking, only the low hum of the climate control system. He went to his study, poured himself a glass of neat scotch, and sat in the dark. He felt lighter. He imagined Clara finding the receipt. He imagined her calling her mother, or paying off her debt, or finally quitting that grease-stained job to travel the world. He felt like a benefactor, a silent guardian. He fell asleep in his leather chair, a smug smile playing on his lips, believing he had bought a happy ending for a stranger. What Arthur Pendleton failed to realize was that when you give someone a life-changing amount of money, you don't just change their bank account. You change their trajectory. And Clara's new trajectory was heading straight for his front door. For 3 days, Arthur Pendleton lived in the quiet afterglow of his own magnanimity. He returned to the glass and steel hive of Pendleton Holdings, moving through board meetings with a newfound sense of moral superiority. He sat across from aggressive hedge fund managers and cutthroat developers, thinking to himself, "I am a man who changes lives. I am a secret architect of destiny." He checked the local news, half expecting a human interest story about a mysterious benefactor at the Starlight Diner. He imagined the headline, "Local waitress given new lease on life." He even considered driving past the diner just to see if the help wanted sign was back up, confirming that Clara had taken his money and run toward a sunset of her own choosing. But the news remained boring, and his phone remained silent. By the fourth morning, the glow had begun to fade, replaced by the sterile, gray routine of his existence. That was until 10:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Arthur was in his home library, a room paneled in dark walnut and lined with first editions he had never read. He was attempting to focus on a quarterly earnings report when a sound vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the polite, electronic chime of the doorbell. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the bronze lion head knocker on the front door. Thump. 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 It was insistent. Aggressive. It sounded like a demand. Arthur frowned. His staff was off on Tuesdays, part of his minimalist living phase where he preferred the house empty 3 days a week. He stood up, adjusting his silk robe, and walked toward the grand foyer. Through the frosted glass of the double doors, he could see a silhouette. It was topped by something bright and yellow. He pulled the door open. The rain had returned, a misty drizzle that coated the world in silver. Standing on his porch was Clara. She wasn't wearing the faded blue polyester uniform. Instead, she wore a bright yellow fisherman's raincoat that looked 3 sizes too big and a pair of sturdy hiking boots. At her feet sat 2 massive, battered suitcases held together by duct tape and hope. Behind her, idling in his circular driveway, was a rusty taxicab that looked like it was held together by the same materials. "Arthur," she said. Her voice didn't have the weary rasp of the diner anymore. It was clear, resonant, and terrifyingly steady. Arthur blinked, his brain struggling to bridge the gap between waitress I gave money to and woman on my doorstep with luggage. Clara. He stammered. What are you doing here? Did the check clear? If there's a problem with the bank, I can call them. The check cleared, she interrupted, stepping forward. Arthur instinctively took a step back. She didn't wait for an invitation. She crossed the threshold, the scent of wet rubber and cheap floral perfume trailing after her. She looked around the foyer at the $$200.000 chandelier, the minimalist art, the sheer, cold vacuum of the space. It's exactly how I pictured it, she whispered. Empty. Efficient. Sad. I'm sorry, Arthur said, his CEO voice finally kicking in. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The money was a gift. A tip. It was meant for you to go. To leave the diner. To start a life. Clara turned to him. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her raincoat pocket. It was the receipt. His signature was circled in red ink. Arthur, she said, her expression softening into something that looked dangerously like pity. You gave me $50,000 for a $12 breakfast. Do you have any idea what that means in the real world? It means you don't have to work at the Starlight Diner anymore. No. She said firmly. It means you bought my time. All of it. For a very long time. Arthur felt a cold prickle of dread crawl up his spine. I didn't buy anything. It was a donation. No strings attached. Everything has strings, Arthur. A man like you doesn't just throw away that kind of capital without wanting a return on investment. You might not know it yet, but you're drowning in this house. You're a man with everything and no one to manage the everything. You tipped me a fortune because you were desperate for a connection. And I am a woman of my word. I don't take money for nothing. She reached down and hoisted the two suitcases with a strength that suggested she had spent her life lifting heavy trays of hash browns. Where is the guest wing? She asked, already marching toward the stairs. Wait. Stop. Arthur hurried after her, his slippers slapping against the marble. Clara, you can't stay here. This is a private residence. I have security. I have lawyers. I have a very busy schedule. She stopped at the foot of the grand staircase and looked him dead in the eye. You have a house with 12 bedrooms and one person. You have a kitchen that has never seen a home-cooked meal. You have a soul that is currently the color of a rainy Tuesday. I've already quit the diner. I've ended my lease. I've donated my furniture to the Salvation Army. She leaned in closer, her tea-colored eyes narrowing. You changed my life, Arthur Pendelton. Now, I'm going to change yours. It's the only way we're even. Arthur opened his mouth to shout, to command her to leave, to call the police. But as he really looked at her, he saw a terrifying spark of purpose. She wasn't a stalker, and she wasn't a thief. She was a woman who had been given a get-out-of-jail-free card and had decided to use it to become the warden of the man who gave it to her. I'll take the room with the south-facing window, she announced, her boots clunking up the stairs. I need the light for my plants. By the way, your pantry is a disgrace. We're having a meeting about the grocery list at noon. Arthur stood in the center of his silent foyer, watching the yellow raincoat disappear into the shadows of the second floor. He looked at the open front door, where the rain was blowing in, wetting his expensive rug. For the first time in his life, Arthur Pendelton realized that some debts are too expensive to pay and some tips are far too high to ever be truly settled. He didn't close the door. He just stood there, wondering if he had just invited a saint or a parasite into his home. Or perhaps, something far more dangerous, a friend. By the third morning, Arthur Pendleton realized that his mansion was no longer a fortress of solitude. It had become a theater of war, and he was losing territory rapidly. He woke up at 6 a.m., as he always did, expecting the cathedral-like silence of his master suite. Instead, he heard the muffled, rhythmic thumping of something heavy hitting a wooden surface downstairs. Thwack! 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 It sounded like a heart beating inside the walls of the house. Arthur threw on a silk robe and marched downstairs, his jaw set in a line of billionaire-grade indignation. He reached the kitchen, a 20,000 square foot marvel of stainless steel and industrial-grade appliances that had, until 3 days ago, never seen anything more complex than a poached egg. The scene was unrecognizable. Clara was there, her hair tied back in a messy bun with a rubber band. She was wearing an oversized "I Love Atlantic City" t-shirt and was mid-swing, using a heavy rolling pin to pulverize a bag of walnuts on his Italian marble island. "What in the name of God are you doing?" Arthur shouted over the noise. Clara didn't stop. Thwack! "Good morning, sunshine. You're up early. High cortisol levels. We'll need to look into some herbal teas for that. I am up early because my kitchen sounds like a construction site. Why are you destroying nuts at dawn?" "Granola," she said, finally stopping to wipe a stray piece of walnut off her forehead. "The stuff in your pantry was processed cardboard. If you're going to run a global empire, Arthur, you need complex carbohydrates and healthy fats. Not whatever oxygen-infused flakes you were eating." Arthur looked at his counters. They were covered in jars of honey, bags of oats, and to his horror a small, chirping cricket in a plastic cage. "Is that a pet?" he asked, pointing a trembling finger. "That's Kevin. He's for the garden. He's part of the new ecosystem," Clara said brightly. She handed him a glass of thick, green sludge. "Drink this. It's kale, ginger, and something I found in your fridge that I'm 60% sure was parsley. I am not drinking that. I want you to leave. Now." Clara leaned against the marble island, crossing her arms. The rolling pin sat beside her like a scepter. "We went over this, Arthur. I've already invested 10,000 of your tip into a retainer for a very bored, very aggressive tenant rights lawyer. Technically, since you gave me the money as a life-changing gift and invited me in. I did not invite you in. You bypassed the door. And invited me in," she continued as if he hadn't spoken. "I am now a live-in domestic consultant. Under the current city ordinances, you can't evict me without 90 days notice and a proven record of just cause. And making granola is not just cause. It's a mitzvah." Arthur felt a vein in his temple pulse. He was a man who moved mountains of capital, yet he was being outmaneuvered by a woman who used to refill his decaf. By noon, the occupation had moved into the optimization phase. Arthur tried to retreat to his study to take a Zoom call with Tokyo, but he found the door locked from the inside. When he finally got it open with a spare key, he found Clara sitting in his $15 ergonomic chair, color-coding his bookshelves. "What are you doing to my library?" he hissed. "They were alphabetized by author," she said, disgusted. "Who does that? It's so academic. I'm doing it by vibe now. This section is existential dread. That section over there is rich people problems. And this corner? This is for things that actually make you smile. It's currently empty, which is a bit of a red flag, don't you think?" "Clara, please," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a desperate plea. "I am a private man. I like my silence. I like my gray walls. I like my books where I can find them." "You like being a ghost," she countered, standing up. She walked over to him, her presence filling the room despite her small stature. "You think that by keeping everything perfect and cold, you're safe. But you're just preserved. Like a bug in amber. You gave me that money because you wanted to feel something. Well, here I am. I'm the something. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of notebook paper. This is the protocol. Today, we're replacing the curtains in the dining room with something that doesn't look like a shroud. Tomorrow, we're hosting a dinner. Arthur laughed a dry, hacking sound. A dinner? For whom? I don't have friends. I have associates, and none of them would step foot in a house that smells like roasted walnuts and kale. Then we'll invite the neighbors, she said. The ones you've ignored for 10 years. Arthur didn't get to the curtains. Instead, he spent the afternoon on the phone with his head of security, a man named Henderson who had served in special forces. Get her out, Arthur whispered into the phone, hiding in his walk-in closet. I don't care about the legalities. Physically remove her and her suitcases. Sir, Henderson's voice was uncharacteristically hesitant. I sent 2 men over an hour ago. Well, they're still there. What? Why? She offered them the granola, sir. And then she started asking them about their health insurance plans. Apparently, she found a loophole in their contract regarding overtime pay. They're currently in the kitchen with her, helping her move a sofa. They said she's a real firecracker. Arthur hung up. He was alone. The fortress had fallen from the inside. He walked out of the closet and headed for the dining room. He expected to see her tearing down the heavy velvet drapes. Instead, he found her standing by the window, looking out at the sprawling, manicured lawn. The rain had stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight was filtering through the clouds. She looked small against the backdrop of his vast estate. For the first time, the crazy waitress persona slipped, and he saw the woman who had lived on $2.13 an hour plus tips for a decade. You know, she said, not turning around. When I saw the check, I thought about running. I thought about a villa in Italy. I thought about never seeing a dirty plate again. Why didn't you? Arthur asked, his voice softening despite himself. Because I realized that the man who wrote that check was in more trouble than I was, she said. She finally turned to him, and her eyes were fierce. You tried to buy your way out of a guilty conscience, Arthur. You thought 50 grand would make you a hero so you could go back to your lonely, gray life and feel good. But life is messy. You don't get to be a hero for $50. You have to actually show up. She walked past him, patting his shoulder as she went. The curtains stay for today. But the dinner is still on for tomorrow. I've already invited the mailman and the lady from the florist. Wear something that isn't black. Arthur stood in the center of the room, the silence of the house returning for a brief moment. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was heavy with the scent of cinnamon and the terrifying possibility that his life was no longer his own. He looked at the optimization protocol she had left on the table. At the very bottom, in messy, looped handwriting, she had added a final note. Phase 12, teach Arthur how to laugh without looking like he's having a stroke. Arthur Pendelton, billionaire and titan of industry, sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. He had tipped $50. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had been robbed not of his money, but of his misery. The Wednesday of the great unwanted dinner began with Arthur Pendelton attempting to flee his own zip code. He had instructed Miller, his driver, to have the Maybach ready at 5:30 a.m. for an emergency site visit to a factory in Ohio that didn't actually exist. He made it as far as the gravel driveway before the car came to a grinding halt. Standing in the middle of the path, illuminated by the dawn mist, was Clara. She was wearing a neon orange crossing guard vest she had apparently found in the garage and was holding a spatula like a stop sign. Ohio is cancelled, she said through the driver's side window after Miller sheepishly unlocked the doors. We have coq au vin to prep, and the florist is arriving at 10. Back to the house, Arthur. Don't make me use the citizen's arrest card I been saving. Arthur slumped against the buttery leather of the back seat. Miller, you're fired. Sorry, Mr. Pendleton, Miller whispered, looking into the rearview mirror with genuine apology. But she made me a breakfast burrito with real chorizo. I can't go back to the protein shakes, sir. I just can't. By 7 p.m., Pendleton Manor looked like it was hosting a convention for the people Arthur usually viewed as background NPCs in the video game of his life. The grand dining table, a 20-foot slab of polished mahogany that usually held nothing but dust and the occasional legal brief, was covered in a mismatched array of floral arrangements. Mrs. Gable, a woman in her 70s who had provided the estate's curated botanical displays for a decade without Arthur ever learning her first name, was currently arguing with Clara about the proper placement of a centerpiece. You see, Arthur, Clara said, grabbing him by the arm as he tried to retreat into the shadows of the hallway. This is Dorothy. Dorothy has been bringing you lilies for 10 years. Did you know she's a champion ballroom dancer in the senior circuit? Arthur looked at Mrs. Gable, who was wearing a sparkly cardigan and holding a pair of pruning shears. I was unaware of the dancing, he managed to say. Then there was Mr. Henderson, the head of security, who was sitting awkwardly in a Louis XIV chair, cradling a glass of the cheap wine Clara had insisted on buying. He was talking to the mail carrier, a man named Jim, about the strategic weaknesses of the mansion's perimeter fence. It's a disaster, Jim, Henderson said, gesturing with a chicken wing. Too much ornamental shrubbery. You could hide a battalion in those azaleas. Arthur stood at the head of the table, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. He wore a navy blazer. Clara had vetoed the black one and felt the weight of his $50 tip pressing down on him. This wasn't just a dinner, it was an audit of his soul. The dinner was, by all objective standards of high society, a catastrophe. There was no caviar. There were no white-gloved servers. Instead, there were large platters of rustic stew, crusty bread that left crumbs on the silk wallpaper, and a level of conversation that made Arthur's head spin. So, Arthur, Jim the mailman said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin that cost more than his Jeep. Clara tells us you're looking to rebrand your lifestyle. Moving away from the Hermit King look, The table went silent. Henderson looked at his plate. Mrs. Gable took a very long sip of wine. Arthur felt the familiar heat of corporate rage rising in his chest. He looked at Clara, who was beaming, looking entirely at home between a security guard and a florist. Clara, Arthur said, his voice dropping into the icy register he used for hostile takeovers. A word. In the library? Now. He didn't wait for her. He stood up and marched out. Behind him, he heard the clatter of a fork and the soft thump of Clara's boots following him. Inside the library, Arthur turned, his arms crossed. This is enough. The optimization ends tonight. I have been patient. I have allowed you to stay in my guest wing. I have eaten your granola. But I will not be made a laughingstock in my own home by my own staff. Clara leaned against a bookshelf, specifically the existential dread section. Is that what you think this is? An embarrassment. I gave you $50,000, Clara. That was the deal. That was the life-changing event. You were supposed to go away and be happy, not bring the postal service into my dining room. Clara's expression shifted. The manic, optimizing energy vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that Arthur hadn't seen before. You think money is a shield, Arthur. You think you can throw a bag of cash at a problem or a person and make them disappear so you don't have to feel the vacuum of your own life. You didn't tip me 50 grand because you're a hero. You tipped me because you were bored and you wanted to see what would happen. Well, this is what happens. People happen. Noise happens. Life happens. You have no right. I have every right, she snapped. Because I'm the only person in this zip code who isn't afraid of your bank account. Do you want to know why I'm really here? Do you want to know what I did with the first 10,000 of that tip? Arthur went still. I assumed you paid off your debts. I don't have debts, Arthur. I was a waitress because I liked the honesty of it. Before that, I was a project manager for a global NGO. I spent 6 years in disaster zones, managing millions of dollars in aid. I left because I couldn't stand the paperwork of human suffering anymore. I wanted to be somewhere where a thank you was just a thank you and not a tax write-off. She stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. I spent that 10,000 on a private investigator. I wanted to know who Arthur Pendelton really was. I wanted to know why a man with 3 foundations and a Philanthropist of the Year award doesn't have a single person in his life who knows his middle name. Arthur felt a chill. My middle name is Thomas. I know, she whispered. And I know your mother died in this house 12 years ago, and you haven't opened the curtains in her old room since. I know you haven't had a meal with a friend who didn't work for you since the Bush administration. You didn't give me $50,000, Arthur. You gave me an SOS. And I'm the only one who answered. The silence in the library was absolute. The sounds of laughter from the dining room seemed a million miles away. Arthur looked at the woman in front of him, not a waitress, not a tenant, but a mirror. What do you want, Clara? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I want you to finish your dinner, she said, her voice returning to its usual, bossy brightness. And then, tomorrow, we're going to start phase 5. It involves a set of paints and that dusty room on the 3rd floor. Arthur looked at his hands. They were shaking, just slightly. He realized then that he couldn't fire her. Not because of the lawyers, and not because of the tenant laws. He couldn't fire her because she was the only thing in his world that wasn't for sale. Thomas, he said suddenly. What? Arthur Thomas Pendelton. You were right. No one has called me that in a long time. Clara smiled, a genuine, soft expression that reached her eyes. Well, Thomas. The Coke oven is getting cold. And I think Jim is about to tell Henderson how to bypass your laser grid using a piece of cardboard and a laser pointer. We should probably go stop him. Arthur followed her back into the light. He was still $50 poorer, and his house was still a mess, but as he sat back down at the table and Dorothy the florist asked him for his opinion on hydrangeas, Arthur Pendelton realized the fine print of his kindness. When you change someone's life, you don't get to choose how they change yours in return. The morning after the dinner party, Arthur Pendelton did something he hadn't done in 12 years, he opened the curtains in the master library before 8 a.m. The house didn't feel like a museum anymore. It felt like a crime scene, albeit a very cheerful one. There was a stray floral arrangement on the piano, a lingering scent of Jim the mailman's tobacco on the veranda, and a stack of dirty dishes in the sink that Clara had intentionally left for communal morning meditation. Arthur found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at a bag of kale. He didn't recoil. He didn't call his lawyer. He simply wondered if he had enough ginger to make the green sludge Clara insisted was liquid life. You're staring at the vegetables again, Arthur, a voice rang out. Clara entered the kitchen, not in her yellow raincoat, but in a pair of paint-splattered overalls. She looked energized, like a hurricane that had finally found a coastline worth hitting. She carried a tray of paint swatches, vibrant blues, sun-scorched yellows, and a green so deep it looked like a forest floor. Phase 5, she announced, slapping the swatches onto the marble island. The 3rd floor. The room of shrouds. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. The 3rd floor was the only part of the mansion that remained truly his, or rather, truly the ghost's. It was where his mother had spent her final days, and where Arthur had locked away every piece of grief he owned, wrapping it in plastic and silence. Clara, I don't think. I know you don't think you're ready, she said, her voice softening. But that room is the anchor dragging this whole house into the sea. You gave me $50,000 to change my life. I'm using the last of my consultation energy to change your past. Grab a roller, Thomas. We're going up. The air on the third floor was different. It was heavy, stagnant, and tasted of dust and unsaid words. Arthur stood before the heavy oak door, his hand trembling on the handle. Behind him, Clara stood with 2 buckets of morning sunlight yellow paint. She didn't push him. She just waited. When the door finally creaked open, the side was exactly as he had left it. Furniture covered in white sheets, like a congregation of ghosts waiting for a sermon. The air was gray. Clara walked to the center of the room. She didn't look at the dust. She looked at the windows. With a sharp, decisive movement, she grabbed the heavy velvet drapes, the ones Arthur had pinned shut a decade ago, and ripped them open. Dust danced in the sudden explosion of light. Arthur flinched, shielding his eyes. "Look at it, Arthur," Clara whispered. "It's just a room. It's not a tomb. It's just wood and plaster and light." For the next 6 hours, they didn't talk about money. They didn't talk about the diner. They painted. Arthur, a man who had never performed manual labor in his life, found a strange, rhythmic peace in the movement of the roller. He watched the morning sunlight yellow swallow the gray walls. He felt the sweat on his brow and the ache in his shoulders, and for the first time, the weight in his chest began to loosen. By late afternoon, the room was transformed. The ghosts were gone, the sheets had been stripped and thrown into the hallway. The mahogany bed frame shone under the fresh paint. "My mother loved this view," Arthur said, leaning against the window frame. "She used to say the sound of the ocean was the only thing that didn't lie to her." Clara sat on the floor, her face streaked with yellow paint. She looked at him with a quiet, knowing smile. "She sounds like she was a smart woman. Probably would have hated what you did to the library." Arthur laughed. It wasn't the dry, rusty sound from a few days ago. It was a real, deep laugh that echoed through the newly brightened room. That evening, they sat on the back patio. Arthur's black and red glasses, a relic of his tech-obsessed phase, sat on the table between them. He looked out at his estate, at the Cullinan idling in the drive, and realized that for the first time, he didn't feel the need to get in it and drive away. Clara pulled a small leather ledger from her pocket. She laid it on the table. "What's this?" Arthur asked. "An itemized receipt," she said. $10,000 for the lawyer and PI. $5,000 for the optimization supplies. $2,000 for the dinner party and Mrs. Gable's ballroom dance fund. $3,000 for miscellaneous making Arthur human expenses. And $30,000, well, that's in a high-yield savings account in your name. Arthur stared at the ledger. "In my name? Why?" "Because my job is done, Arthur," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a sadness she couldn't quite hide. "The 90 days aren't up, but the mission is. You've opened the windows. You've had a dinner party. You've laughed. You don't need a $50 waitress hostage anymore." She stood up, brushing the dried paint off her overalls. "I've called a cab. It'll be here in 20 minutes. I'm going to go find that villa in Italy now. Or maybe a bookstore in Vermont. Somewhere where I can be just Clara again, and not the purpose." Arthur felt a sudden, sharp panic. It was the same feeling he had when a market crashed, but deeper. More personal. "You can't leave," he said, standing up. "The granola, the curtains. Henderson finally likes his job. I haven't even learned how to make the green sludge without it tasting like lawn clippings." Clara smiled, a bittersweet curve of her lips. "You'll figure it out, Thomas. That's the point. You don't need me to force you to live anymore. You're already doing it." She turned to walk toward the house to grab her battered suitcases, the ones held together by duct tape and hope. Wait. Arthur called out. She stopped, her hand on the glass door. What if? Arthur paused, searching for the right words, the ones that didn't involve a contract or a bribe. What if I didn't want a consultant? What if I wanted a partner? Not in the business sense. In the life sense. Clara turned around, her tea-colored eyes unreadable. Arthur, you can't tip someone into staying. We've been over this. I'm not tipping, Arthur said, stepping toward her. I'm offering a trade. You stay here. Not in the guest wing, but in the house. We finish the library. We keep the mailman from breaking the security system. And in return, you teach me how to be the man who wrote that check without knowing why. Clara looked at him for a long time. The sound of a car horn echoed from the front of the house. The taxi had arrived. The silence stretched between them, no longer cold and sterile, but vibrating with the potential of a new world. She looked at the taxi, then back at the billionaire in the yellow-stained blazer. Fine, she said, a mischievous spark returning to her eyes. But we're getting rid of that Cullinan. It's too flashy. We're getting a used Jeep. Something with character. And you're doing the dishes for the next 6 months. Arthur smiled. It was the most expensive agreement he had ever made, and for the first time in his life, he knew he was getting the better end of the deal. Deal, he said. Epilogue, the new normal. A month later, the Starlight Diner was under new management. But every Tuesday at 2 a.m., a black and red glasses-wearing man and a woman in a bright yellow raincoat would sit in the corner booth. They didn't order the $12.45 breakfast. They brought their own granola. And when they left, the tip was always exactly 25%. Because as Arthur Pendelton had learned, you don't need $50,000 to change the world. You just need to be brave enough to stay for the coffee.